Now, let me introduce the presenter. Fionn O'Sullivan has worked for 10 years as a consultant on economic growth projects, and he has directed and managed a wide range of evaluation, appraisal, and other research projects for public and private sector clients. Currently, he is a senior consultant at ITAD and is part of the BEAM team, coordinating the work on evaluation and evidence. And with that, he also authored the evaluation guide we're talking about today. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Fionn now for his presentation.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending the webinar today. So Marcus has just given a brief introduction, but I wanted to add some further initial comments to set the scene and also to explain why Beam Exchange has gone to the trouble of producing its own guidance on evaluation in this context. And I just thought to mention a debate hosted by Beam on evidence last autumn, which is very interesting. It was quite a wide participation by members of our community. And what it revealed is that as practitioners, we do generally believe that the programs that we are working with can produce valuable results. But there is a lot of skepticism about evidence. And one of the reasons for this is the one that Marcus has mentioned, is that few in-depth impact evaluations have been published. And a second one was that there were some weaknesses in some of the earlier evaluations. And perhaps with reason, it's taken time for evaluators to get their heads around the specific characteristics of market systems approaches and what it means for evaluation. But some of the weaknesses included the use of rather simplistic theories of change that didn't take into account the ambitions of programs to achieve systemic change, or not really looking at unintended consequences or possible negative effects, or poor attention to data quality and poor attention to issues of bias. So these are the background reasons for having or for Beam commissioning an evaluation guidance document. So I didn't mention a couple of other ones, which there are actually continuing debates around systemic change and around evaluation designs. And so there are a number of questions. There are issues with evaluations that have been carried out, and then a number of questions about how to do evaluation in this field. And so that's really why Beam has gone to the trouble of commissioning a guidance document and publishing it. And this is the guidance document, which is now available on the Beam website. And I'm going to be basing my presentation on this document. So there are lots of things that I could talk about in this presentation, but we have limited time. So what I've decided to do is to focus on 3 key issues. But I would obviously recommend people who are interested to explore the issues in more detail to go and have a look at that document. But the 3 issues that I'm going to talk about today are, well, firstly, the importance of theory-based evaluation as the underpinning approach in a market systems context. And in a moment, I'll explain what this means and why it's necessary. And secondly, I want to touch on the debate about systemic change and complexity, and what are the implications for evaluation, and what, in practical terms, can we do about these. And lastly, I think it's safe to say that even people here who are not evaluators will have come across large-scale quantitative surveys and the use of focus groups and other methods to understand, what our programs are doing. So there's a question mark over which methods we should use and in which contexts, and that really hinges on the question of which different evaluation designs or combinations of designs are appropriate at which moments in a market systems, in a program using a market systems approach. So I'm going to cover those 3 issues. So firstly, theory-based evaluation. So a key point is that the basis for what evaluators do in a market systems context is to use a theory-based evaluation as the underpinning for their work. Now, to try and explain what theory-based evaluation is, I've shortened it to TBE here in this slide. There's really two parts of it, and it's not that complicated. So the first part is developing a model which summarizes how you think your activities will lead to outputs and outcomes. In other words, the term we're all familiar with, a theory of change. And the second part of theory-based evaluation then consists of gathering evidence through field research to test if your theory works. So a key point about testing your theory is that you can use a range of designs or methods. So a key point is that theory-based evaluation is methods neutral. So it does raise the questions of which designs are appropriate, and I've mentioned that that's an issue that I'll come back to in a moment. And I should, maybe I can clarify what theory-based evaluation is by saying that not all evaluations will look at the mechanisms for change in the way that theory-based evaluation does. So for example, an experimental approach or quasi-experimental approach which looks at differences in outcomes for a treatment group who have participated in an activity and a control group who have not participated, that in itself may show the results or the impact of an activity, but it won't in itself shed any light on mechanisms. So theory-based evaluation is really focused on mechanisms, and there are two fundamental reasons for using it as the underpinning for evaluation. And the first of these is that market systems have different levels. So I'm going to briefly flash up the diagram that some of us may be familiar. This comes from the M4P guidance manual, and you may be familiar with it. But this is a conceptual representation of a market system. And you can see from this diagram in the middle that there are transactions between buyers and sellers at the heart of the market system. But it's not only that. There are also supporting functions like infrastructure or technology, and there are also rules and policies. And so all of these are elements of a market system. So market systems work at several levels, and programs typically use a number of different interventions working at different levels. And that means that you need different approaches for evaluating change at these different levels. For example, if you're looking at activity between buyers and sellers, so you might, if it was an agricultural context, you might undertake a large-scale survey of farmers, for example. But if you want to know how government regulations are changing, then we might have a very different approach. You might be implementing a program of interviews with selected officials, those who can tell you about the regulations and how they've changed and so on. So you're going to need a number of different methods, and the point about a theory-based approach is that it provides a way of tying these methods together by tying everything back to the theory of change, and therefore it helps you to make sense of the program as a whole. And the second reason is that intervening and achieving results in a market system is a difficult thing to get right, and it typically requires a try and see approach. So for example, where you introduce a new technique or innovation into the market in a pilot, and then if it seems to work, you try and scale it up. But this means you need to know if things are not working as planned, then why that is. And this requires a focus on mechanisms, and that's what theory-based evaluation does. So theory-based evaluation is the basis for undertaking evaluation in a market systems context. Now I want to move on to the question of evaluating systemic change. So a first point is that market systems have many parts, as I've just shown you in that donut diagram. So it's not just interactions between buyers and sellers, it's a range of other actors and the other elements in the market system. And this really brings us to the point that market systems are usually complex entities. And I'll leave aside how we define complex for the moment, but this does lead us to some of the insights about complexity identified by systems theorists and also complexity science and complexity thinkers. And this is really a complicated issue, and I can't, in the space of this presentation, discuss it fully, but there are some simple points. The first is that change probably won't happen in the linear manner that our theories of change lead us to believe. And some unexpected impacts are normal, and it's quite possible also that there may be some undesirable consequences. So change in markets affects different people in different ways, and some may be losers. You need to be able to look at that. And the further point is that systemic change takes time. Systems evolve over time. It's not something that happens immediately or not often. And evaluations need to take this time perspective into account. And I'll mention an example just in passing of good practice in relation to this, which is the evaluation of the PEPE program in Ethiopia. Just to illustrate what this time perspective can mean, in that case, the evaluation will include a survey 5 years after the program ends, in 2024, to see whether systemic change has been achieved. So that's actually a much longer time scale than probably we're used to in evaluation. And the last point is that in a system, there are many different points of view, and no single perspective will fully explain how things are changing. And where you do see positive changes, it's important to remember that the program is just one element which is contributing to these, and so you need to be able to take account of that in your evaluation approach, and I'll talk about that as well in a second. So, following on from the previous points, how can you evaluate systemic change? And this is another complicated issue, but I'll just touch on one example here. The first point is that you need to look at the things that you expect to happen. In other words, you need to see if the things that your theory of change leads you to expect are occurring in practice. So a very common approach for a market systems program is to introduce a new technique or innovation into the market and see if it improves outcomes or appears to improve outcomes for poor people, and if it does, to try and scale it up so that this technique or innovation becomes widely adopted. So just to take one example from the work of the SAMART program in Nepal, this piloted the use of a new biofungicide to counter a common disease in ginger plants. And so the program started with a pilot to encourage farmers to adopt the product and also to encourage agro-vets to stock it. So in this case, the evaluation would need to identify the success of these changes. I mean, was the product adopted, and did agro-vets adapt their behavior as well, or their business model? But you also need to see if the wider market changed. So was this biofungicide so successful that its use expanded into other regions? And did the market change in other ways? For example, did suppliers of agricultural products start to introduce complements to this biofungicide, or did they change their behavior? Did they respond in some other way? And so you'll see that I've mentioned the words in the explanation I've just given, which is adopt, adapt, expand, and respond. And some of you may recognize this as the basis for the AAER framework. And this provides one framework for testing for expected or hoped for changes. I have to say that there are other approaches, and the AAER framework is just one of them. But it does provide a useful basis for testing for expected changes. But this leaves open the question of unexpected impacts. So is it the case, for example, going back to this example of ginger production, if the innovation was successful and increased productivity of ginger activities, then did this cause an expansion, which might be a good thing, but what were the possible unexpected consequences? For example, was the land for other food staples reduced, pushing up local food prices? I'm not saying that this would happen, but I'm just pointing out that market change is complex, and we do need an evaluation approach which can identify these unexpected things that may happen. And there are some evaluation designs and methods which are good at identifying these, and there are others that aren't. So I think this takes us nicely into the question of evaluation designs and which evaluation designs are appropriate in a market systems context. So on this issue, there are broadly two approaches to assessing causality in evaluation. And when I say the issue of causality, it's the simple question, is an intervention or program responsible for changes that have occurred, or is it not, or to what extent is it responsible? And this is really the heart of evaluation. And in evaluation practice, we can identify two approaches. Now, the first of these is attribution, and this term is used in a number of ways, but I want to define it in a very, well, not in a very narrow sense, but in the narrow sense of experimental, or those experimental or statistical methods which allow you to quantify impact. Now, I'll give you an example, and this is from a case study which is, I think you can find on the DCED website, about the use of a quasi-experimental method to identify the impact of promoting tractor use in Nigeria. It was the PropCon program. And this method was able to identify income improvements of between 51 and 57% for farmers using tractors compared to a control group who did not. So those who took up the innovation improved their income by around a half. So in that case, you can see that methods embodying the principle of attribution can be very powerful to show the impact of your intervention or your program. Having said that, they only work in certain circumstances. And to summarize briefly, these circumstances include where your target group and the effects that you're expecting can be clearly delineated in advance. So, for example, you know that your target group is a group of farmers in a particular area, and the effect that you're expecting to see is a change in income. It also requires a situation where time and resources and practical considerations allow you to undertake large-scale surveys. And some people have asked questions about disaster context, and there are obviously some development contexts where large-scale surveying is difficult, which means these approaches wouldn't be useful in those circumstances. Another point is you need to be able to identify a control group to compare with the treatment group, those who are receiving the benefit of the intervention. That may be difficult where your program as a whole has been successful in changing the market and changing the market for everyone involved in it. So that would mean that your that would lead that your control group is in some way similar to your treatment group, technically described as contamination. So I'll come back in a moment to discussing where we can and where it's difficult to use these approaches based on attribution in a market systems context. I want to come to the second approach for establishing causality, and this is to look at the relative contribution of an intervention to an outcome. And so this is quite different to an experimental or statistical method. And so instead of quantifying impact, looking at or using the principle of contribution means describing how a change has occurred and then using a process of argument, weighing up the evidence to make the case that the intervention or program is wholly or partly responsible. And two approaches embodying this approach, and there are several others, are, for example, contribution analysis and process tracing. And as I said, these work by researching and reviewing a range of evidence and then making a case. And it's important to note that this evidence might include quantitative and qualitative evidence. So evaluations based on the principle of contribution, well, they have various characteristics, but one of them is that they may be more effective where it's not possible to say what impacts have occurred beforehand or who's been affected. So having discussed these two approaches and types of evaluation design, how do these relate to a market systems context? So I'm going to do this in the next slides by trying to dissect how a market systems approach works. And I have to say about this schema that I'm now going to present to you that this is, I think, fits many programs, but it may not fit everyone. So, I mean, there are always exceptions, but I think it's a useful way forward for the reasons that you'll see. So starting here, with firstly looking at just a single program intervention, a single project. So if we take the example of the biofungicide for ginger, the program worked with partners to introduce this new innovation into the market with a pilot project. And they did so because they hoped that the results would show higher crop yields for farmers and therefore it would improve income, maybe employment, and ultimately reduce poverty. So here you can see these effects. The intervention with growth in jobs and income and reduced poverty. And we could describe these perhaps as the intervention level effects, which would happen typically in a pilot situation. However, as a market systems program, and in this particular case of the Samart ginger intervention, it didn't aim solely to improve the lives of the immediate participants, but instead intended that the new technique was spread throughout the ginger producing sector in Nepal, that the technique could be adopted by other farmers, and also that the number of suppliers selling the biofungicide would increase, and so on. So already, as I've already discussed, where you have these expanding and responding effects, using the terminology of the AAER framework, these provide examples of systemic market change. And you hope then that these systemic effects have a net positive impact overall, and therefore that you multiply the benefits of your intervention among wider populations and into other parts of the country. So you can see here now intervention level effects and systemic effects. But lastly, however, as I mentioned earlier, we also need to consider that a number of unintended impacts might also occur. These might be positive or negative. And as I also said, complexity thinking encourages us to think that these effects might occur in a number of places, and perhaps in places we don't necessarily expect. And you can see that here with these red dotted arrows, that other impacts may occur in a number of different places. So you have going over the diagram again, intervention level effects, systemic effects, and unexpected or negative effects. So how does this relate to the question of evaluation designs that I was talking about a moment ago? So let's go on to the next slide and see how this works. So in this table, again, looking at designs for evaluation designs for individual interventions, you can see the start of a summary of how we can use different designs to identify impacts for an individual intervention. And along the top of this table, you can see the types of effects I've just described. So there are intervention level effects, there are systemic effects picked up by the AAER framework or another framework, and their wider impacts. And then there are other unexpected effects. And along the two rows at the bottom are designs based on the principle of attribution and designs based on the principle of contribution. So I'm now taking this to the next stage, and as you can see that I've filled in the row based on attribution. You can see here there's a description or an argument about which techniques you can use to identify change at the level of an individual intervention. So designs which are based on the principle of attribution, including experimental or quasi-experimental or statistical designs, can be very powerful in quantifying the impacts of an individual intervention, as we saw with the case of tractors in Nigeria. But can you use these designs to identify systemic change or unexpected impacts? And my argument is they're not really appropriate for this task. And one of the reasons is that, as I said earlier, that you need to specify the effect that you're looking for in advance before you test for it, taking an experimental or quasi-experimental approach, for example. I don't think this approach is very useful for this because your effects might be unexpected, and you need to investigate systemic change in a number of areas, not just in the areas you expect it to happen. So the argument is that you really need an approach, or you need to combine an approach based on the principle of attribution with one that allows you to investigate and then to weigh up the evidence. And this means that at least part of your evaluation will include a design element based on the principle of contribution. And coming back to my earlier point about theory-based evaluation being methods neutral, what I want to make clear is that you can combine different evaluation designs and methods in a theory-based evaluation. And so it's perfectly possible that you could look at impacts on farmers using an experimental or quasi-experimental design, as was the case in Nigeria, while at the same time considering the wider impact of the intervention using other techniques such as contribution analysis to look at other impacts. So I've talked so far about what you do in the case of an individual intervention, but I want to turn now to the question of how a program as a whole works. And programs are typically portfolios of interventions, sometimes intervening in a number of different markets and sometimes complementary interventions in a single market. And so here I put intervention 1 down, and you can see that the diagram that I showed you a moment ago. So here is one intervention in the portfolio, but clearly a program would have more than one intervention, and so here is a set. So one way to evaluate the impact of the program would be to evaluate each separate individual intervention, and then you could sum the impacts in some way. But doing this would miss a key point about programs, and this is that they are, or they aim to be, more than just the sum of their parts. So for example, they try to achieve synergies, often implementing a number of interventions that complement each other. For example, working to change government regulations that promote growth in the sector at the same time as working in the field with buyers and sellers. And so you then get into the question of synergies and whether they actually add up to something meaningful. Do they create an impact which is more than the sum of the individual interventions? And so you need to have an evaluation design, or part of your evaluation design needs to be appropriate for identifying this issue about synergy. And just in passing, I should say that synergies might be negative. I don't think it happens often, but program interventions do sometimes get in the way of each other, and that would be an example of a negative synergy. So coming back to the table, which I showed you earlier, this time I'm presenting it for the program as a whole. And the basic point is that I think it's very difficult or impossible to use the principle of attribution to look at the impact of the program as a whole. And remember that I defined attribution in a narrow sense in terms of putting precise numbers on impacts. And I think that if you're looking at the question of synergies, then you really need to, you're not going to use an experimental or quasi-experimental approach. You need to look at how different interventions have worked together, how the program as a whole has worked together, whether it's coherent, and this really requires different methods. Now, I'm running out of time, and I think we can come back to this. I expect some of you will have some further questions about this, so let's come back to that in a moment. I just want to conclude my presentation by summing up the key points I've made. And the first of these is that the theory of change and theory-based evaluation is the basis for what we do when we're evaluating in a market systems context, and this requires a mixture of methods and probably a mixture of designs. So evaluations using designs based on the principle of attribution may work for part of what you're trying to do, and they can be powerful in quantifying the effects of individual interventions. And donors, of course, are keen on being able to see, a number for the impact of their intervention or program. But I don't think that these designs are suitable for exploring systemic change or for identifying unexpected impacts. And so that they need to be complemented with evaluation designs that work on the basis of contribution. So I've talked about contribution analysis and process tracing, or I mentioned those briefly earlier. And these are methods which they might use quantitative data, but they also use qualitative techniques, using interviews or focus groups or reviews of market data where it's available and so on. And lastly, in a systems context, there's no single perspective which is right. And so this places an emphasis in evaluation on getting the views of a broad range of different actors. I suppose a final point is that the aim of market systems programs or programs using that approach is to improve the lives of poor people. So it's very important that their views, which may not be a single view, are reflected in the evaluation, and the evaluation probably uses a participatory approach to be able to identify these. So that's the end of the presentation, and coming to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Finn. Wow, that was quite technical, I think, but I'm very happy to report that we didn't have a steep drop of participants, so I think we are with the geeks in the room here. I don't have any questions yet from the room, so I would really encourage you to go to the Q&A section down on the right and type away with your questions, because I'm sure there are some. We have about 20 minutes for questions and comments as well, so if you have any comments or additions, please feel free to voice them. Given the large share of actually implementing stuff in the participants here, I would like to start with a question that we got in beforehand by somebody who registered, who I know is actually an implementing person, not an evaluator, Maezam Fande from the Ghana MADE project. And his question is very much around the, I guess, the interface between evaluation and the work he is doing, which is monitoring results measurement in a project. And I know that this is not necessarily the topic of this guide, but I'd still be interested, Finn, what you have to say about how can this interface be be designed in a way that it's actually leading to additional value. Or maybe to quote Valleso's questions, how can external evaluators play an effective role on measuring results in market systems program? I would say together with internal monitoring results measurement people.
Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, so actually we do talk about this a bit in the guidance about what the role of an evaluator is. So I would say go and have a look. It's the section towards the end, actually. But an initial point, I think I mentioned that market systems programs need to adopt a try and see approach. That often you're testing the water. You do your research at the beginning of the program, and you try and see what will work, but you really find out about this in the course of implementing your interventions, and you need to be able to adapt if required if things don't immediately work out. So a traditional approach to evaluation was that evaluators were very independent and stood apart from the program, and that evaluation took place at particular moments, you know, a baseline and then perhaps a midterm and then an end of program evaluation. But with adaptive programming, the role of the evaluator probably needs to change somewhat, partly because the program needs to know what's happening, what's the effect of an intervention sooner, and they can't wait for several years. And so this need to be adaptive means that the traditional distinction between monitoring and evaluation is breaking down to some extent. So there might be some moments where you use things which are associated with evaluation during the course, or with an end-line evaluation during the course of a program, for example, you know, using a quasi-experimental method, you know, to see whether an intervention like the tractor one I mentioned is working, whether it should be scaled up. So there is, you know, a question of who would do that. Would the monitoring team do that, or actually that's the specialist skills are required for that kind of exercise, and that's typically the field of evaluators. So you probably need to, or you may need to bring evaluators to work in alongside you in a closer way than happened in the past. Excuse me. That brings into one of the key questions, I suppose. If your evaluators are working closely with you, then is their independence compromised in some way? I mean, traditionally, as I say, that evaluation was done at an arm's length. It was independent with the aim of it being objective. And perhaps if people are working more closely with you, then you need other ways of ensuring that their objectivity is maintained. So, for example, one way of doing that might be to beef up your quality assurance of the evaluator's work through independent peer review. And a second point, I suppose, is that you might want to bring evaluators to work more closely with you, but you don't want to. You want to make sure that there isn't duplication of work. So this means setting out probably at the start of the process what the evaluators will do and what monitoring team will do. So, for example, that you don't try to collect the same data and so on. And I suppose the final point is that bringing evaluators into the process doesn't mean substituting them for monitoring. And I think monitoring is a substantial activity in a program using a market systems approach, perhaps more substantial than in the past. And so you shouldn't substitute that by bringing evaluators in. So those are some of the issues that you might consider. But I'd recommend looking at the guidance document for a bit more detail on that.
Thank you, Finn, for that. I would also like to point to a number of so-called evaluation synopses that we produced for the Beam Exchange that are actually portraying ongoing evaluations that are designed to run alongside working market systems development programs. So it's not that they're ex post, but they're being done at the same time. And we have 4 of these online now, so you can have a look how it is actually done in current practice. The next question is coming from Lucy Moore, and she is asking specifically about what you introduced as methodologies or tools for the contribution side of things as opposed to the attribution side of things. And she asks, how do you decide between doing contribution analysis, process tracing, outcome mapping, outcome harvesting? So those are the methods that you somehow related to the contribution way of doing evaluation.
Okay. So I have to say something about the I think the proliferation of methods in recent years, and these ones, outcome mapping, outcome harvesting, contribution analysis, and so on, things that have been defined in the last few years. And I think that's very helpful for the field, that we should try and tie down what we're doing and describe it and give it a name. But I also think that there's a risk of conflating or thinking that things that are actually quite similar are in fact different. And so I'll start by talking about contribution analysis. And contribution analysis basically works on identifying a range of impacts that you think of the result of the program, and then gathering evidence and trying to put together a story about whether your intervention has worked or not. And so an example I can give of was a financial services program in Kenya, which wanted to improve access to financial services for poor people. And one of the ways it did this was to help what had been a building society transform itself into a bank, which had different capabilities for loans and so on, and allowed it to expand its range of services by doing that. Now, the question came of what was the program responsible, or what part did it play in that process? And the evaluators in that case were able to put together a story looking at what had happened in the development of that market for financial services. And they put together a story saying, well, there hadn't been any other conversions to a bank previously in Kenya, and there was one afterwards, but without support it took 3 years rather than a year. And so it basically looked at what was happening in the market and made an argument saying there was a bit more to it than that, saying that we think this is what happened, and we think that the program's technical support in this case did make the difference. So that is how contribution analysis works. And I think actually when you look at outcome harvesting, I mean, I do talk about this in the guide and what the differences are, but in some ways outcome harvesting does something similar in the sense that it goes out and looks at different things that have happened in the market, and then uses a range of information sources to try and tie down why these have happened and if there's an impact from your program. So I think in that sense they are somewhat similar. And I'll say also that something about process tracing I think is again quite similar to contribution analysis in the sense that it builds an argument. The distinction between process tracing and contribution analysis is that process tracing has a set of logical tests, which I won't go into the details of them here, but it's considered by some of its proponents to be more rigorous because when you make your case that one thing has led to another, you have to formally consider these particular tests. And in that sense, it's considered to be more rigorous. But I think as I say, that these are not always entirely different. I mean, but if you have a look at guidance on contribution analysis, if you have a look at guidance on outcome harvesting, and you can find that, for example, on the Better Evaluation website, then adopting one of these techniques will probably be sufficient. So I hope that's a reasonable answer.
Thank you, Finn. There have been a few questions that I would take together around aspects of evaluating market systems approaches in crisis-affected areas. We had two questions from people beforehand, Hélène Drillard from France and Ayman Ramses from Relief International in Iraq. But we also had a question here in the room from Lily Mohidin. And essentially the questions are all around how, when you go into crisis-affected areas, do you have to do things differently? Do you need to take special things into account compared to what you described during this webinar, which supposedly is more for kind of normal settings, maybe?
Right. Okay. Well, I'll try and answer that. I have to say that I'm not actually an expert at all in looking at disaster response and so on. But I'll try and identify. Well, try and answer. So, I mean, the first question is: in a disaster situation, are you, or crisis situation, are you actually using a systemic approach? And what I've discussed in my presentation earlier is about using a systems approach for disaster response. And that is something which is about long-term change. So, as I mentioned, that you're normally working with different parts of a market system. You know, you might be working with government on policy and regulation. You might be working with infrastructure providers, and you might be working with buyers and sellers. So, the first question is that what your crisis approach program or is actually doing? But if it is, I mean, I can see, for example, that if you're working in disaster response, for example, if you're trying to help communities to build more weather resilient buildings, or if you're trying to get traders to increase food stocks, then and if you're working in a systemic way, then yes, you might apply the principles that I've set out earlier. And I suppose the first thing is in each of those cases that the basis of what you need to do is founded on your theory of change. So what are you trying to do? What are the incentives for traders not to stock large quantities of food, or what are the incentives at the moment for weaker buildings to be constructed? And then you need to look at how you're trying to change those incentives. And then whatever the mechanism that you're trying to work through, that is the focus for your evaluation work. So you need to you need to identify suitable methods to see if those things are happening, and probably that you'll be working through the actual methods you use will be the same that you'd use in other evaluation contexts. So you'd use surveys, for example. I mean, I suppose this is a key point, that the methods, the actual tools, day-to-day tools that you use in market systems, so surveys, interviews, review of data, those won't be different. But I suppose in a disaster context that I mean, it depends what the context is, but it may not be possible to do that. Or if you're in an emergency situation, you may not have time, or the market actors that you're trying to influence may not be in a stable state, that they actually may not be reacting, they may not be making decisions in the way that they would do when things are more normal or stable. And I think as an evaluator, you probably have to make a decision about whether you can actually whether you can implement surveys in that context, and you can't always do evaluation. I mean, there is a separate body of monitoring and evaluation thinking about disaster context, which I can't really deal with here, and I'm not that familiar with. but some of the things that you would do, you'd expect to do with a stable situation, you won't be able to do in the disaster context. So it may have to wait. I'm happy to take questions offline about that, because I realise that I'm not able to give an expert answer. So I'm happy to come back to the couple of people who sent in the emails and see if I can give them a better answer if they're not happy with that one. But I'll leave it for there for now.
Okay. We have another 6 minutes to go, so there is room for a couple of more questions. The first one coming from Marco Decker, and he asks, can you elaborate on aspects of systemic change, for example, crowding in and copying? What are the latest insights on that, and how could you collect data on that? Especially because he mentions in most companies that crowd in would protect their strategies, reasons, or intentions.
Well, that's a very good question about what do you do in a market situation which is a competitive environment. How do you collect information from companies? And there probably isn't a single good answer about that, but and I think we've talked in the BEAM monitoring guidance about collecting information from market actors, and I think it would be helpful to refer to that. I'm not sure if it answers your question, but it does provide some further thinking about that. You can find that on the BEAM website. But my personal experience is that I've actually always been surprised by the extent to which companies and people will talk about what they're doing and why they're doing it. So I think it's always worth trying to talk to companies that are crowding in and copying in, and talking to them directly. And you know, it's sometimes possible to give safeguards that this information is really just about the success of the program, that it's not about a competitor trying to find information. So that, I mean, that's one thing you can do. The second thing is where companies publish information. Now, medium-sized companies often do that about what they're trying to do, whether sales brochures or if they have a website, then looking at that, then that can be a source of information. And the other thing is also to talk to your program partners. So they will obviously be aware of what's happening in the market and how their products are performing, but they may also have an idea about what competitors are doing. So, I mean, it's worth talking to them and about what they think is happening in the market and trying to put together an overall picture. So there isn't a single good answer, but I have to say that, I mean, I think this is getting into the domain of market research, and people don't always want to talk to market researchers and talk about what they're doing. But as a field of research, it does, you know, it can be successful. And I think that the general sort of market research techniques which are used to understand what's happening in the market can be applied in most situations. So I think that's what I would do. That's been my experience anyway of using those things I've talked about.
Great, thank you for this, Finn. I think we will have one last question, which is from Piu Seze. I hope I said that correctly. He wants to know a little bit more about the evaluation of interventions when you have several interventions within one program. So could you please talk about the evaluation of several interventions in a sector, for example, within one program?
Yes, I think, I mean, the key question is, you know, how do these interventions complement each other, and are they working together in some way? So have they been designed together? Have they been thought through as part of a wider analysis of what's happening in the sector? And you know, you think that would normally be the case, that you start off with your overall evaluation of the sector or the market and the way it's working, and then you introduce a number of interventions. But it is possible that interventions are started for other reasons, although they're not introduced in a coherent way. And obviously, where thinking hasn't been done at the beginning, to think through how interventions will work together, then it's unlikely or less likely that they're going to generate the synergies I talked about. And so those are key questions that an evaluator would start off, is just looking at program documents and interviewing program staff to see, was the design of these interventions done together. And then they probably also want to talk about how they've been implemented in practice, which means talking to the to program staff and field staff. And some simple questions that an evaluator would be wanting to look at would be, do you work together? Do you talk to each other? What impacts do you think that the other intervention is having? Is it helping what you're doing? Is it hindering? So I talked about interventions to work with government to change regulations. And I also talked about work going on to the field level, so that the people implementing the field level intervention might be saying, well, yes, this work with the government has gone on, but we don't see any practical change at all on the ground, and another approach is necessary. So I think those are things that an evaluator coming in would want to see, really to identify where there are complementarities or synergies, and really trying to tease these out, to specify them, and then gather evidence that there's actually some kind of mutual benefit, that they're working in synergy that's generating this. So I think that's part of an answer about how to do that, or what the issues are.
Perfect. And with this, we come to the end of the hour. The only thing left to do for me is to close the webinar. First of all, I would like to thank you for your very active participation and all the good questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all of them. We could answer most of them, so we'll try to follow up about the remaining questions after the webinar. We very much hope that you could get some ideas about evaluation, which are relevant for your work. You can find the BEAM evaluation guide on the BEAM website. Just go to beamexchange.org and then click on guidance in the menu, and you will be able to select evaluation.
Can I just ask, Marcus, before we finish, is there a web address or an email address, sorry, that some of those people who've asked questions which haven't been answered could send their questions to, so that we could take this a bit further?
I think we do have the addresses, so we can follow up with the people individually.
Okay. Well, I'll do my best to give an answer to those people who weren't able to get their question answered now. Perfect.
So if you haven't done so already, you can also sign up on the BEAM website to receive regular updates about news and events, including jobs and training opportunities. It might be interesting for you. Last but not least, I would like to thank our presenter, Fionn, for introducing us to the guide. I realize it's not an easy job to get such an extensive guide into a interesting presentation in less than an hour, so thanks for that. And please do participate in our short survey, which will pop up automatically when you close the webinar. Oh, and I just did get a message, so if you have any more questions, please send them to contact@beamexchange.org, and we can follow up with you individually then. That is contact@beamexchange.org. We hope that you enjoyed this event with BEAM, and we wish you a very good rest of your day.
Thank you.